He stormed into the garage, shouting about rules and violations. But the moment his eyes caught the sheriff's star on the wall, every word died in his throat. The air shimmered with heat that afternoon, the kind that made the asphalt ripple and tools too hot to touch. Ethan Dalton wiped the sweat from his brow as he leaned over his motorcycle, the rhythmic click of his wrench echoing softly in the stillness. The sun bore down through the gaps in his backyard fence, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the silence. It was one of those afternoons meant for peace, when a man could lose himself in his work without interruption. But peace was rare in Oak Ridge Meadows, not with Harold Kent around. Ethan was tightening the last bolt when it happened, the sharp metallic rattle of his garage door jolting open. The sound sliced through the quiet like a warning shot. He froze, his hand hovering mid-air. For a second he thought he'd imagined it. But then came the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the concrete floor inside his garage. His heart quickened. No one had permission to be in there. The HOA had no jurisdiction inside his home, much less his private workspace. He set his wrench down quietly and walked around the side of the house. The closer he got, the more he felt that something was wrong. The garage door was fully lifted, casting a strip of sunlight across the concrete. Inside stood a man whose posture screamed arrogance even before his face was visible. Harold Kent, the president of the Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association. His perfectly ironed shirt glowed white against the dim light, and his expensive loafers clicked against the floor as he examined Ethan's shelves like an appraiser inspecting goods. "Afternoon, Harold," Ethan said, his voice calm but cold. Harold flinched slightly before composing himself. "Oh, Ethan, I was just inspecting. We've had some complaints about loud machinery. HOA regulations are quite strict about breaking into private property," Ethan cut in, stepping closer. His voice carried an edge, though he never raised it. Harold's eyes flickered with something, fear maybe, but it vanished behind a forced smirk. "Now let's not use words like that. I'm the HOA president. I have the authority to ensure all community standards are—" "You have no authority to enter my home," Ethan said firmly. He stopped just short of him. The distance between them was filled with tension. Harold tried to hold his ground, but his gaze wandered. His fingers drummed nervously on the side of the tool chest, and then his eyes caught it, the large framed sheriff's star mounted above the workbench. The golden metal gleamed even in the dim light, polished and proud, a relic from another life Ethan rarely spoke about. For a moment, Harold didn't breathe. The confident S from his face, leaving behind a pale, stunned expression. What is this?" he asked, his voice a strained whisper. His hand trembled slightly as he pointed toward the badge. Ethan said nothing at first. He watched the man's composure crumble. The same man who'd bullied neighbors into repainting fences and cutting down trees, now frozen like a child caught trespassing. Finally, Ethan crossed his arms and said quietly, "That's something you should have never seen." The silence that followed felt heavy. Even the faint hum of the overhead light seemed to fade beneath the weight of it. Harold shifted uneasily, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. The heat outside pressed in, yet he looked cold, sweat beating at his temples. He tried to find his voice again, but when he did, it wavered. You can't intimidate me," he muttered. "Whatever that thing is, it doesn't change the fact that you're violating—" "Enough," Ethan interrupted, stepping forward until Harold instinctively backed into the workbench. The soft clatter of a socket wrench hitting the floor punctuated the tension. "You broke into my property. You've been warned before. I suggest you leave, now, before this turns into something official." Harold's lips parted, ready to argue, but the faint reflection of the star in Ethan's eyes stopped him. He couldn't tell if Ethan was bluffing, or if the badge meant what he feared it did. Either way, he didn't want to find out. He stepped back, fumbling for words. "You think you can scare me with old trinkets?" "I run this neighborhood. You're just another resident who'll learn to follow the rules." Ethan let out a slow breath, a calmness that unnerved Harold more than anger would have. "We'll see," he said simply. "But from now on, keep your inspections to public property. The next time you step in here without my consent, I won't be the one answering questions. You will." Harold turned sharply, pretending to brush dust from his shirt as he made for the open door. The sunlight outside cast a harsh glow on his face, exposing how pale he'd become. He muttered something under his breath, something about authority and compliance, but his words trailed off as he crossed the threshold. Ethan watched him leave, the rhythmic sound of Harold's hurried footsteps fading down the driveway. For a long moment, Ethan just stood there, the air thick with unspoken consequences. His gaze shifted back to the sheriff's star on the wall. The badge wasn't a decoration. It was a symbol of a life left behind, of an oath that didn't disappear just because the uniform did. He reached up and dusted it off with his thumb, the faint reflection of the golden star catching his eyes. A quiet storm brewed in his chest, not of anger, but of resolve. Harold Kent had crossed a line, and he didn't even realize how deep he'd gone. Outside, the distant sound of a car door slamming echoed down the street, followed by the hum of Harold's engine fading into the afternoon heat. Ethan exhaled slowly, set his tools back in order, and closed the garage door with a deliberate click. He knew Harold wouldn't stop here. Men like him never did. But now, the game had changed. He glanced once more at the badge, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon light like a warning flare. A faint smile touched his lips, not one of amusement, but of certainty. Harold tried to regain his arrogance, but the tremor in his voice gave him away. He didn't know it yet, but that single trespass would unravel everything he'd built, and by the time it was over, the entire community would know who Harold Kent really was. The morning after Harold Kent trespassed into Ethan Dalton's garage, Oak Ridge Meadows seemed unusually quiet. The sun crept over rows of identical rooftops, casting sharp beams of light on manicured lawns and white picket fences that lined the pristine cul-de-sac. The kind of place that looked peaceful on the surface, too peaceful. Beneath that suburban calm, tension hummed like a live wire. Every homeowner in Oak Ridge Meadows knew one unspoken rule: never cross Harold Kent. Harold was a man who demanded control of everything within sight. In his mid-50s, his hair was always combed neatly to one side, his shirts perfectly pressed, his shoes gleaming like mirrors. He had a way of smiling that didn't reach his eyes, a politician's smile, polished and rehearsed. On the surface, he appeared neighborly. He waved to joggers, complimented lawns, and hosted quarterly community brunches meant to promote harmony. But everyone knew those brunches were really about power. They were Harold's stage, a chance to remind everyone who ruled the neighborhood. Ethan had been in Oak Ridge Meadows for barely 6 months when he first noticed how deeply Harold's influence ran. It started subtly. Letters slipped under doors, reminders about property aesthetics, fines for leaving garden hoses visible. Most residents didn't dare challenge him. They'd pay the fines, fix whatever Harold demanded, and keep their heads down. Fear kept the system running smoothly. Ethan wasn't like them. He had moved into Lot 42 for its quiet seclusion, a chance to start over after leaving law enforcement. He valued privacy, independence, and order, the kind he built himself, not the kind dictated by a man with a clipboard. But from the first day Harold saw him unloading tools from his truck, Ethan could feel the scrutiny. Harold's eyes lingered too long, studying him like a problem to be solved. At first, Harold's harassment came in the form of polite reminders. A note about his motorcycle being unsightly from the road. A warning that his workbench visible through the open garage violated aesthetic regulations. Then came the letters with penalties. $50 for leaving the trash can out too long. $100 for excessive oil staining on the driveway. Each one signed with Harold's looping signature and the HOA's embossed seal. Ethan ignored them. That's when Harold began to escalate. One Saturday morning, Ethan heard knocking at his door. When he opened it, Harold stood there holding a clipboard, his smile tight. "Good morning, Mr. Dalton," he began, adjusting his cufflinks. "We've received a few complaints about your property's maintenance. I'd like to take a look around and make sure everything's in compliance." Ethan leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "Complaints? From who?" "Anonymous sources," Harold replied smoothly. "You understand, it's my duty as HOA president to investigate such matters." "You mean you want to snoop?" Ethan said, his tone even but unamused. Harold's grin faltered. You can either cooperate voluntarily, or I'll have to issue a non-compliance citation. The choice is yours. Ethan held his gaze, his expression unreadable. The choice, he said slowly, is for you to stay off my property. Then he shut the door. Harold stood there for a moment, stunned. No one had ever dismissed him like that. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of defiance. His jaw tightened as he scribbled something angrily on his clipboard before stomping away. From that moment, Harold made it his personal mission to break Ethan Dalton. Over the following weeks, small annoyances began to pile up. Ethan's mailbox was suddenly marked as non-standard. The HOA newsletter featured a section titled Community Cooperation, a reminder about following the rules, clearly aimed at him. And then came the final straw. A formal letter accusing him of operating a commercial repair business out of his garage, completely fabricated, of course. Harold's influence went beyond paperwork. He had allies on the board, men like George Peterman and Alan Fry, neighbors who enjoyed the illusion of authority. Together, they carried out Harold's petty vendettas with smug satisfaction. They'd drive past Ethan's house at night, flashing their high beams into his windows, or leave HOA pamphlets wedged under his door, as if to remind him he was always being watched. Despite the harassment, Ethan remained calm. Years in law enforcement had taught him how to handle bullies. He started taking quiet mental notes, times, dates, witnesses. Harold thought he was untouchable, but Ethan could already see cracks forming. One evening, Ethan attended an HOA meeting at the Oak Ridge Community Hall, a bland brick building near the main gate. He wanted to observe, maybe see how deep Harold's power ran. When he walked in, the meeting was already in full swing. Harold stood at the podium, his voice echoing across the room as he discussed new guidelines for driveway visibility. His tone was authoritative, rehearsed, like a man running for office rather than leading a neighborhood. Some residents, Harold announced, seem to think the rules don't apply to them. We cannot allow exceptions. Standards are what separate us from chaos. Several board members nodded dutifully. A few residents clapped. Ethan stayed near the back, arms folded, observing quietly. He could tell Harold thrived on this attention, the applause, the obedience. But something else caught his eye. When Harold clicked through a presentation on the projector, one of the slides showed an image of a property with red markings around the driveway, his driveway. The caption read, "Example of ongoing non-compliance." A low murmur spread through the room. People turned, whispering. Harold grinned, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "We've tried reaching out to the homeowner in question," he said, eyes locking onto Ethan. "But unfortunately, cooperation has been limited." Ethan didn't move. He simply smiled, a calm, unsettling smile that made Harold hesitate for a fraction of a second. After the meeting, Harold approached him near the exit. "I hope there are no hard feelings," he said in a tone that suggested the opposite. "None," Ethan replied smoothly. "But I should warn you, public defamation has consequences." The faint color drained from Harold's cheeks. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Ethan said, stepping closer. "Just reminding you, some rules apply to everyone." Harold forced a chuckle, pretending to shrug it off, but Ethan could see the twitch in his jaw. That exchange planted a seed of unease in Harold's mind, one that would grow into paranoia. As the days went on, Harold's obsession deepened. He started digging for information about Ethan. He called local contacts, trying to find out where he had worked before moving in. He even asked a friend at City Records to check for any permits under Ethan's name. What he found was nothing. No business licenses, no records, no background beyond his purchase of Lot 42. To Harold, that made him dangerous. To Ethan, it made Harold predictable. One afternoon, Harold parked his silver sedan at the end of Ethan's street and watched from a distance as Ethan carried lumber into his garage. The sight of him working calmly, ignoring every petty attack, infuriated him. He rolled down his window, muttering, "Let's see how calm you are when you're fined out of this place." He didn't realize Ethan had noticed him. The faint reflection of Harold's car in a tool's chrome surface had given him away. Ethan turned slowly, eyes narrowing just enough to let Harold know he'd been seen. The HOA president stiffened, started the car, and drove off, pretending it had been coincidence. But that one moment changed the balance of power. Later that night, Ethan sat in his living room, reviewing one of Harold's latest letters. It was full of baseless claims, unauthorized equipment storage, unsightly items visible from the street. Ethan placed it neatly in a folder labeled Kent, Evidence. He'd started keeping every piece of paper, every notice, every dated envelope. Harold thought he was waging a campaign of dominance, but Ethan was quietly building a record. Meanwhile, Harold's behavior toward the rest of the community grew worse. He fined an elderly resident named Mr. Lang for having a non-compliant mailbox post. He threatened to tow a teenager's car for parking in an unregistered manner. People whispered that he'd gone too far, but no one dared oppose him outright. Fear of retribution kept them silent. Then came a surprising twist. During one board session, Harold received an anonymous letter in his own HOA mailbox. It contained a single sheet of paper with a typed sentence. "You've crossed the wrong man." No signature, no address. The words rattled him. He immediately suspected Ethan, but he couldn't prove it. At the next meeting, Harold's demeanor was different, twitchier, less composed. He rambled through the agenda, making small mistakes, snapping at his board members. When Ethan walked in late and sat quietly near the back, Harold lost his train of thought completely. The sight of him, calm and unbothered, set his nerves ablaze. That night, as Harold returned home, he stared at his own reflection in the window. For the first time, he felt the weight of something he couldn't control. His reign over Oak Ridge Meadows was absolute, until Ethan Dalton moved in. He didn't like not knowing what the man was capable of. He didn't like feeling watched. And yet, driven by ego, Harold couldn't stop himself. His pride wouldn't let him back down. He doubled down on his harassment, determined to break Ethan's composure. He just didn't realize he was walking straight into a trap. He believed everyone feared his power, that no one would ever dare challenge him. He strutted through every HOA meeting like a dictator addressing his subjects, convinced that he was above the law. But he had no idea that behind my quiet demeanor and simple home repairs was a man who had worn the badge and one who never forgot how to build a case. The night was quiet, too quiet for Oak Ridge Meadows. Streetlights hummed faintly, casting long shadows across the neat rows of manicured lawns and polished driveways. Most homes were asleep, curtains drawn, porch lights dimmed. But at Lot 42, a different kind of silence ruled, a watchful stillness. Inside, Ethan Dalton sat in his living room chair, a cup of coffee untouched beside him. He had just returned from a long day at the workshop and was reviewing some old case files, something he did now and then to keep his mind sharp. The rhythmic ticking of the clock filled the air. Then, faintly beneath it, he heard something unusual, a metallic click. It came from the direction of his garage. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He set his coffee down slowly, every muscle in his body instinctively tensing. Years of law enforcement had trained him to recognize the difference between a random noise and intent. This was intent. Someone was trying to open his door. He stood quietly and moved toward the hallway, his footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. He didn't switch on the lights. Instead, he paused by the window and peered through the narrow slit in the blinds. The motion light above his garage flicked on. There, half hidden in the glow, stood Harold Kent. The man wore a pressed polo shirt tucked into khakis, as if breaking into someone's property required proper attire. In his hand was a small silver key, and he was fumbling with the garage lock. Ethan felt a mix of anger and disbelief rise in his chest. For a moment, he considered stepping outside and confronting him directly, but another instinct, older and colder, stopped him. Instead, he reached for his phone and began recording. Through the lens, he caught Harold's every movement, the way his eyes darted nervously toward the street, the faint tremor in his hand as the lock finally turned, the cautious push of the garage door as it lifted with a soft groan. Ethan muttered under his breath, "Big mistake, Harold." He didn't rush. He wanted to see how far Harold would go. From inside, he could hear faint rustling, Harold moving things around, boxes sliding, drawers opening. The garage light flicked on, illuminating the inside. Ethan stepped closer to the window, camera still rolling. Harold's shadow moved across the wall until it stopped, right in front of the display shelf where Ethan kept his memorabilia. There, gleaming under the light, was the sheriff's star. A quiet gasp escaped Harold's lips. Ethan could almost see the realization dawn on his face, the emblem, the engraved nameplate, the commendation plaque beside it. It wasn't just a hobby collection. It was a record of years in law enforcement. Harold stumbled back, his confidence draining. For a second it looked as if he might flee, but pride won over reason. He straightened his back, adjusted his shirt, and began taking photos with his phone. Of what? Ethan couldn't tell. The man's arrogance blinded him to the fact that he'd just committed a serious crime. Ethan finally stepped into the kitchen, flicked on the back porch light, and opened the door. "Evening, Harold," he said calmly. Harold froze mid-step, his face pale as he turned. "Mr. Dalton, I was investigating a noise complaint. Several neighbors heard—" "Noise complaint?" Ethan interrupted, leaning against the doorframe. "Funny. Didn't hear a thing myself," Harold stammered, his voice faltering. "Well, you see, as HOA president, I have authority to inspect—" "Not without consent," Ethan said sharply, "and not with a master key from the HOA lockbox. That's trespassing, Harold." Illegal entry. Harold's jaw twitched. For a brief second he looked like a child caught stealing from the cookie jar. But then his usual smugness crept back. Now, let's not make a big deal out of a misunderstanding. I'll just make a note and we'll be on our way." Ethan took a step forward, his tone cold and precise. "You're already on your way, to a complaint file thicker than your HOA handbook." Harold's smile faltered. Without another word, he hurried off, muttering something about policy checks as he disappeared into the night. Ethan didn't call the police. Not yet. He knew men like Harold, men who hid behind rules until those rules turned against them. He wanted evidence, proof airtight enough that even Harold's connections couldn't spin it away. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. A letter had gone out overnight, HOA stationery, embossed with Harold's signature. It accused Ethan of unauthorized mechanical activity, claiming his garage was being used for potential commercial repairs. Another notice followed that afternoon, citing multiple property standard violations. Ethan read the letters quietly at his kitchen table. His hands didn't shake, his face didn't flinch. But behind that calm exterior, something sharpened. Harold hadn't just crossed the line, he'd planted his feet on the wrong side of it. Later that day, while Harold strutted around inspecting lawns and counting mailbox heights, Ethan began his own kind of inspection. He opened his garage and carefully installed 3 new devices, miniature cameras disguised as motion sensors. Each one pointed at a key entry point: the door, the window, and the lockbox. A 4th camera faced the driveway. "Let's see how you like being watched," he murmured. Over the next week, Ethan gathered footage quietly. Harold's obsession grew. He stopped other neighbors in the street, waving copies of supposed violation reports. Some ignored him, others nodded nervously, afraid of his influence. Only one neighbor, a retired postman named Glenn, dared to ask Ethan what was happening. "I've seen that man snooping near your place twice this week," Glenn said one evening. "You sure you're safe?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I'm safer than he thinks." Then came the twist Ethan didn't expect. On Thursday morning, a courier delivered a certified envelope. Inside was an official notice from the county records office. Someone had filed a complaint about hazardous chemical storage on his property, complete with photos of oil cans and labeled containers in his garage. Ethan's jaw tightened. Those photos were doctored. He didn't even own half of what was in the pictures. Harold had escalated to falsifying evidence. That night, Ethan sat in his study reviewing the footage. There it was, Harold entering the HOA office after hours, removing something from the cabinet, and leaving minutes later. The timestamp matched the filing time on the complaint letter. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the glow of the monitor reflecting in his eyes. "Got you," he whispered. But he didn't act immediately. He wanted Harold to hang himself with his own rope. So he waited. The following weekend, Harold hosted the monthly HOA inspection walk. A small group of residents trailed behind him as he paraded through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand. When he reached Ethan's property, he put on a show. "Mr. Dalton," he announced loudly, "it's been brought to our attention that you've been conducting unauthorized work here. HOA policy requires an immediate cease and desist." Ethan stepped out of his garage, wiping his hands on a rag. Unauthorized? That's a new one. You got proof? Harold lifted his clipboard dramatically. Photographic evidence, verified by county report. Ethan crossed his arms. The same report filed by someone using HOA credentials after hours? For a split second, Harold's confidence faltered. He forced a laugh. You're mistaken, Mr. Dalton. Am I? Ethan asked, pulling out his phone. Then maybe you can explain this. He played a short video, grainy but clear enough. Harold, inside the HOA office, opening the cabinet, taking out the master keyring and slipping a folder under his arm. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Harold's face turned white. That's taken out of context, he sputtered. You can't. Oh, I can, Ethan interrupted. And I will. Tampering with HOA documents, falsifying reports, and illegal entry into private property. Those are serious charges once certain conditions are met. The silence that followed was crushing. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Harold mumbled something about misunderstandings before storming off, his composure cracking under the weight of exposure. Ethan didn't chase him. He didn't need to. The cameras would do the rest. That night, as he reviewed the day's footage, he found one last piece of the puzzle, a small but damning scene. Harold, in his panic, had returned to the HOA office, shredding papers and deleting files from the computer. What he didn't realize was that the security system backed up everything to a cloud drive, one managed by the county for transparency. By the time Ethan closed his laptop, the case was airtight. He had every image, every timestamp, every lie documented. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Harold Kent had no idea that his inspection had just built the case that would destroy him. Ethan took a final look at the sheriff's star on the wall. The faint reflection of light caught the edges of the metal, gleaming like a silent promise. Then quietly he said to himself, I didn't argue or yell. Instead, I smiled, installed a few hidden cameras, and began collecting every piece of evidence I'd need to bring the king of Oak Ridge Meadows to his knees. The storm that Harold Kent had started was no longer his to control. It was Ethan Dalton's to direct. Every move the HOA president made, every smug announcement, every whispered conversation in the parking lot was now being watched, recorded, and cataloged with surgical precision. Harold thought he was untouchable, that his authority shielded him from consequence. He had no idea he was constructing his own downfall, one smug grin at a time. Ethan's days fell into a quiet, meticulous rhythm. Each morning he reviewed footage before heading to work. Every evening he returned home, backed up files, labeled evidence, and wrote detailed notes about Harold's behavior. The investigation had become his private operation, a case file thickening by the day. The faint hum of his computer was now a familiar companion in the late hours of the night. The first breakthrough came on a humid Wednesday evening. Ethan sat at his desk, reviewing audio clips from his cameras. Harold's voice echoed faintly through the speakers, arrogant, dismissive, commanding. Make sure those new citations go out before the meeting, Harold's voice said. I want Lot 42 listed twice, trash bins and lawn decor. It'll keep him busy. Then came another voice, one Ethan recognized as a board member named Robert Mills. But there's no actual violation, Harold. You can't just... I can, and I will, Harold interrupted sharply. He's a problem. People like him think they can ignore authority. He needs to learn who's in charge here. Ethan paused the recording. He leaned back, the chair creaking softly beneath him. Harold's arrogance wasn't just personal, it was institutional. He'd infected the HOA with it. But what Harold didn't realize was that each careless word, each power-drunk command, was now part of a growing case file that would bury him. Over the next few days, Ethan began organizing everything into categories: trespass, forgery, coercion, misuse of HOA authority. The more he dug, the more rot he found beneath Oak Ridge Meadows' polished surface. Harold's leadership wasn't just overbearing, it was corrupt. But it was the financial documents that changed everything. Late one Friday night, Ethan noticed something odd in one of the monthly HOA budget reports that had been emailed to residents. A payment listed as Consulting Services, Oak Ridge Compliance Group caught his eye. The firm's address seemed unfamiliar, and the amounts were unusually high, several $1,000s each month. Ethan traced the name through public records, and after a few minutes, the truth appeared on his screen. The consulting group was registered under a man named Roger Kent, Harold's cousin. Ethan stared at the screen, disbelief turning to quiet satisfaction. "Got you," he whispered. He began cross-referencing invoices with HOA bank statements he'd legally accessed through archived resident emails. The pattern was clear. Funds meant for neighborhood maintenance, repairs, landscaping, pool upkeep, had been rerouted to Roger's company for compliance consulting. In reality, no consulting had ever taken place. Harold had created a money funnel, moving thousands of dollars from community accounts to his cousin's pocket. It was embezzlement, clear as day. Still, Ethan wasn't reckless. His law enforcement instincts told him to verify everything twice. He printed records, saved files, and time-stamped them with screenshots showing their origin. He even captured footage of Harold discussing adjusted budgets with another board member, his tone smug and evasive. By the following week, Ethan had built a report so detailed it could have been presented in a courtroom. But he wasn't done yet. He knew that evidence alone wasn't enough. There needed to be witnesses, people willing to stand beside him when the truth came out. He started with Glenn, the retired postman who'd been one of Harold's earliest targets. Glenn opened his door and squinted at the folder Ethan held. "You've been digging, haven't you?" Ethan nodded. "More than digging. I've got proof Harold's been using HOA funds for personal gain. I need others who've been wronged to come forward." Glenn motioned for him to come in. "You'll have my statement." That man fined me twice for mailbox height, then refused my appeal because I spoke out of turn. He's been running this place like a kingdom. Over the next few days, Ethan reached out quietly to others, men who'd been fined unfairly, threatened, or publicly shamed by Harold during meetings. Each one had a story. A young father whose request to install a small swing set was denied because it ruined the uniformity. A retired engineer fined for keeping his truck in the driveway while repainting his garage. Every one of them carried quiet resentment, and now proof of Harold's abuse of power gave them purpose. One by one, they joined Ethan. By midweek, he had a small coalition of residents united by frustration and evidence. They met in Ethan's garage, surrounded by folders, photographs, and laptop screens glowing with data. "This is more than HOA misconduct," Ethan told them during one late-night meeting. "This is fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of funds. Once this hits the county, it's out of his hands." "What if he finds out?" one neighbor asked nervously. "You know how he is. Vindictive." Ethan looked up from his notes, his expression calm but resolute. "Then he'll prove our case faster. Everything he does now is being watched," and it was true. The hidden cameras continued capturing moments that fed the growing case file. Harold unlocking the HOA office after hours, shuffling papers into a folder, arguing on the phone with his cousin about transfer amounts. The evidence was undeniable. Then came the unexpected twist. One night, as Ethan sat in his study, his phone buzzed with a notification. One of his motion sensors had been triggered, again at the HOA office. He opened the live feed and froze. Harold was there, pacing. Another man stood beside him, Roger Kent. They were arguing heatedly. "I told you can't keep moving that money," Roger hissed. "It's already been flagged once by the bank." "Relax," Harold snapped. "No one here understands the paperwork." "I'll fix it before the audit." Ethan quickly hit record, capturing every word. But then Roger said something that made him lean forward. "What about that neighbor of yours? The one with the cameras?" Harold's face darkened. "Dalton. He's been a problem since day one, but I've got something planned for him." Ethan's stomach tightened. He knew Harold was arrogant, but the edge in his voice suggested something more dangerous. He saved the clip and immediately made an encrypted backup. Whatever Harold was planning, he'd be ready for it. The following morning, Ethan drove to the county administrative office. He walked through the marble halls with the quiet confidence of a man who'd done this before. He filed a formal complaint, attaching a detailed dossier, videos, emails, invoices, and witness statements. The clerk who received the file skimmed through it, her eyes widening slightly at the evidence. "This is extensive," she said softly. "We'll escalate this to the county fraud division immediately." "Good," Ethan replied. You'll want to monitor the HOA's accounts before he tries to clean them." By the time he walked out of the building, the autumn wind had picked up, carrying a crisp chill through the air. Ethan stopped for a moment in the parking lot, watching the leaves swirl past. It felt like the calm before a storm that Harold wouldn't see coming until it was too late. In the days that followed, rumors began spreading quietly through Oak Ridge Meadows. A few board members had received official notices requesting financial documents. Harold's confident stride had grown stiffer, his temper shorter. At meetings, he barked orders, snapping at anyone who questioned his authority. The more he tried to assert control, the more people began to see the cracks. Ethan stayed silent, watching, waiting. He didn't need to confront Harold yet. The annual HOA meeting was only a week away, and it would be his stage. Each night leading up to it, he reviewed the evidence one more time. The annual Oak Ridge Meadows HO. A meeting had never drawn a crowd like this. The community center was packed wall to wall, a low buzz of conversation echoing beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. Folding chairs lined every inch of the room, occupied by homeowners clutching printed notices, payment receipts, and questions they'd never dared ask before. Tonight, though, the air felt different. It carried anticipation, uneasy, electric, and thick with the promise that something monumental was about to happen. At the front of the room stood Harold Kent, his silver hair slicked back, his suit crisp, and his trademark smirk firmly in place. He adjusted the microphone as if it were a royal scepter, scanning the audience with the smug confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Behind him hung a large banner that read, "Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association, Annual Review and Election." The irony was almost poetic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold began, his voice steady and self-assured, "thank you for attending this year's meeting. I know some of you have concerns, but let me assure you, this community is in the best hands possible." He gestured broadly as if presenting himself as the gift Oak Ridge Meadows didn't deserve. "We must enforce order, even when some homeowners think they're above the rules." He paused deliberately, eyes flicking toward Ethan Dalton sitting near the back of the room. The jab was subtle, but everyone knew who it was aimed at. A few neighbors shifted uneasily, others glanced toward Ethan with cautious curiosity. Harold's voice carried the rehearsed rhythm of a man accustomed to commanding attention. That was Ethan's cue. He rose slowly, the movement drawing heads across the room. In one hand, he held a thick binder filled with neatly tabbed documents. In the other, a small USB drive glinted faintly beneath the overhead lights. His expression was calm, deliberate. His posture that of someone who didn't just believe in what he was about to say, but knew it would change everything. "Actually, Harold," Ethan said evenly, his voice cutting through the room like a clean blade, "I think the community should see who's really been breaking the rules." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Harold's smirk faltered slightly, replaced by the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Mr. Dalton," he replied with forced civility, "you're not on the agenda tonight. If you have concerns, you can—" Ethan ignored him. He walked straight to the projector at the front of the room and plugged in the USB drive. The screen flickered, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the faint whir of the machine. Then, the first video began to play. Gasps broke out immediately. The footage was crystal clear. Harold Kent, under the dim light of early evening, unlocking Ethan's garage door with a master key from the HOA lockbox. He stepped inside, snooping through toolboxes and shelves, muttering to himself. Then the audio clip followed, his voice unmistakable as he instructed a board member to make sure Dalton gets cited twice, something that sticks. The room fell dead silent. Ethan advanced to the next clip, Harold's voice again, this time on a recorded phone call. "Roger, the invoices need to look legitimate. Just copy the format from last month. No one here reads the fine print anyway." Murmurs erupted from the crowd. Faces turned pale, eyes darted from Harold to Ethan and back to the screen. Harold raised his hands, sweating now beneath his tailored suit. This is taken out of context," he shouted, voice cracking under the strain. "These recordings are illegal." Ethan didn't flinch. "All recordings were obtained in public spaces or during HOA proceedings. Perfectly legal." He flipped open his binder, revealing a series of documents, transaction logs, signed statements, and financial records, each neatly labeled and color-coded. "These," he said, holding up a sheet, "are copies of the payments you authorized from the HOA maintenance account to a consulting firm owned by your cousin, Roger Kent. Every one of them is fraudulent." The projector screen changed again, this time displaying scanned invoices. The company names matched, the signatures were identical, except for one detail. They were traced copies of other residents' names. The proof was irrefutable. Harold's confident stance disintegrated. He wiped his forehead with a trembling hand, his voice dropping to a desperate plea. "You don't understand, this was standard procedure. Every HOA has discretionary spending." "Not for personal accounts," Ethan interrupted sharply. "Not when the county already confirmed an active investigation." The words hit Harold like a physical blow. His knees wavered slightly as Ethan pulled out a final document, a stamped letter bearing the insignia of the county sheriff's office. He read aloud, his tone steady and clear. "This letter verifies that the evidence provided by Mr. Ethan Dalton concerning the misappropriation of HOA funds, document forgery, and unlawful entry is currently under official investigation by the County Fraud Division." The room erupted. Dozens of voices overlapped. Shock, disbelief, anger. Board members stood frozen, one dropping his pen onto the table. A few residents who had once been Harold's staunch supporters now turned their chairs away, unwilling to even look at him. Ethan took one step closer to the podium. His gaze didn't waver. "You've spent years bullying this community, Harold, threatening families, fabricating violations, and treating this neighborhood like your private kingdom. But those days are over." Harold's mouth opened, but no words came. His face had gone pale, his body rigid. His hand grasped the edge of the table as if holding on to the last sliver of control. You set me up," he finally choked out, his voice trembling. "I didn't set you up," Ethan replied calmly. "You did that all by yourself. I just made sure people could finally see it." Then came the final blow. Ethan turned back to the audience, holding the letter high enough for all to see. "I'm a former county deputy," he said, "and I know exactly how to handle evidence like this. So when Harold trespassed into my garage, forged documents, and filed false reports, I made sure every second was recorded. The investigation is already underway." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Harold's legs buckled. He stumbled backward into his chair, breathing heavily, sweat glistening at his temples. His eyes darted wildly between the board members, seeking an ally, someone to defend him, but found only silence. Even Robert Mills, his longtime associate, stared at him with disgust. A single voice broke the quiet, a resident near the back whispering, "Call the sheriff." Moments later, the doors opened, and two deputies stepped inside. Their badges caught the light, glinting like cold stars. Harold's head snapped up, his eyes locking on them in disbelief. Ethan didn't move. He stood calmly, binder still in hand, as the deputies approached the podium. "Mr. Harold Kent," one of them said, "you're under arrest for suspected embezzlement, document forgery, and unlawful entry." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the room. Harold tried to protest, muttering half-finished excuses, but his voice was drowned out by the collective murmur of the crowd. Neighbors who had once feared him now whispered in astonishment, some even smiling faintly as justice unfolded before them. As the deputies led Harold toward the exit, he turned his head, eyes glazed with humiliation and disbelief. For the first time, he looked small, no longer the untouchable tyrant of Oak Ridge Meadows, but a man stripped of every ounce of power. Ethan met his gaze one last time. The same badge Harold had once mocked now gleamed from the deputy's chest, sealing his fate. The crowd parted in silence as Harold was escorted out of the room. The sound of the door closing behind him was met with an exhale that felt like release, the neighborhood finally freed from the weight of his rule. Ethan stood for a moment longer at the front, scanning the faces of his neighbors. Relief, disbelief, even gratitude reflected back at him. He closed the binder, the faint click of the cover signaling the end of a long, bitter chapter. The king of Oak Ridge Meadows had finally fallen, and justice, quiet and unshakable, had taken his place. The community center was packed for the annual meeting. Harold stood at the front, adjusting his tie, smiling as if nothing in the world could touch him. "We must enforce order," he said pompously, "even when some homeowners think they're above the rules." That was my cue. I stood holding a thick binder and a small USB drive. "Actually, Harold," I said evenly, "I think the community should see who's really been breaking the rules." I plugged the drive into the projector. The room went dead silent as footage played. Harold sneaking into my garage, forging signatures, and discussing fake invoices with his cousin over the phone. Gasps filled the air. His smile dissolved into panic. "This is taken out of context," he shouted, but it was too late. I flipped open my binder, revealing a signed statement from the county sheriff's office verifying my evidence. When I added that I was a former deputy and that an investigation was already underway, Harold's legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed into his chair, pale and speechless. Minutes later, deputies entered the room. The same badge he had once mocked now sealed his fate. The community watched as their self-appointed king was escorted out in handcuffs. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of community authority, the misuse of personal privacy, and the severe consequences of vigilantism. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of dignity and accountability, showing that disrespect for property can lead to unexpected law enforcement intervention.